She said it without raising her voice, without hesitation, like it was a fact that had already been decided long before I ever walked into her life. My ex is part of my life. That's not changing. And in that moment, I realized the conversation wasn't starting. It had already ended. My name is Nolan Prescott. And until that night in our kitchen in Greenwich, Connecticut, I believe my marriage to Vivian Aldridge was built on mutual respect, clarity, and quiet understanding. I was wrong in a way that doesn't explode immediately, but slowly tightens around your chest until you can't breathe without noticing it. Vivian didn't say it like a threat. She said it like a boundary. And boundaries, when spoken calmly, are harder to argue with than anger. I didn't respond right away. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't know what I was disagreeing with yet. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was settled. Like this wasn't a conversation she expected to have twice. Earlier that evening, I had come home from the firm later than usual. A client issue had stretched into the kind of meeting where everyone talks carefully and nothing gets solved quickly. I walked into the house expecting silence, maybe a glass of wine waiting on the counter, something familiar. Instead, I saw a second phone on the kitchen island. Not hers, not mine, just sitting there like it belonged. I asked her about it casually. She hesitated for less than a second. Then she said, "It's Carter's. Carter Whitfield." The name I had heard before, but never in detail. Always mentioned lightly, like an old college friend who occasionally texted. Nothing that felt threatening. Nothing that demanded attention. But the phone changed something. It made Carter real in a way he hadn't been before. "Why is it here?" I asked. She poured herself water before answering. "He stopped by earlier." That was the first moment something shifted. Because stopped by isn't how you describe someone you barely keep in touch with. That's how you describe someone who feels comfortable walking into your space. Our space. I asked her why she hadn't told me he was coming. She didn't apologize. She didn't justify. She simply said, it didn't feel necessary. That answer didn't raise her voice, but it raised everything else inside me. It wasn't the visit itself. It was the assumption that I didn't need to know. That's when the conversation turned into something heavier. Not louder, just heavier. I asked her how often she saw him. She didn't answer immediately. She thought about the wording. Then she said sometimes. Sometimes is a dangerous word. It hides specifics. It avoids accountability. It creates room for interpretation. I pressed further. How often is sometimes? She met my eyes then, and that's when she said it. Calm, unshaken. My ex is part of my life. That's not changing. There are sentences that don't just answer a question. They redefine the relationship. This was one of them. I didn't argue, not because I accepted it, but because I understood something deeper in that moment. If I had to argue for my place in her life, I'd already lost it. That night, we didn't fight. We moved around each other quietly, like two people pretending nothing had shifted while both knowing everything had. I went to bed earlier than usual. She stayed in the living room longer than usual. Neither of us asked why. The next morning, I woke up before her. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the feeling that I didn't know what I was waking up into anymore. Marriage is supposed to create clarity. But suddenly, I felt like I was living inside a blurred outline of something that used to be clear. At work, I couldn't focus the way I usually did. I replayed her words in different tones, trying to find a version where they meant less. There wasn't one. Calm words are the most honest ones. That's what made them hard to escape. I didn't tell anyone. Not my colleagues. Not my closest friend, Reed Calloway. Because explaining it would require me to define something I didn't fully understand yet. That evening, I came home earlier than usual. I didn't plan it, but part of me wanted to see if the house felt different when I wasn't expected. Vivian was in the study, on a call. Her tone was softer than usual, not romantic, but familiar. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have. Then I walked in. She looked at me, surprised, but not guilty. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't nervous. She was simply continuing something she didn't believe required concealment. After she ended the call, I asked who it was. She didn't hesitate. Carter. No shift in tone. No attempt to soften it. Just the truth. That's when I realized this wasn't about secrecy. It was about acceptance. her acceptance of him still being in her life, and her expectation that I would accept it too. Before we go further, tell me honestly, if you were in that moment, standing in your own home, hearing your partner say this without apology, would you confront it immediately, or would you step back and observe first? Because what I chose next changed everything that followed. I didn't argue that night either. Instead, I asked a different question. What does he mean to you now? She thought about it. Not carefully, just honestly. He's someone who knows me in a way that didn't disappear just because we ended. That answer wasn't romantic, but it wasn't neutral either. It acknowledged history as something active, not past. I asked her if she still had feelings for him. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She said, that's not the point. And maybe she was right, because the point wasn't what she felt. The point was what she allowed. Over the next few weeks, nothing dramatic happened. No arguments, no ultimatums, but something changed in the structure of our daily life. She spent more time on her phone. She stepped out occasionally without much explanation. Not secretively, just without the habit of informing me anymore. That shift was subtle, but it carried weight. It signaled independence in a space that used to be shared. I started noticing small things. Her tone when she mentioned Carter. The ease with which his name entered conversations. The lack of hesitation. It wasn't careless. It was intentional. She wasn't trying to hide him. She was trying to normalize him. That realization forced me into a position I hadn't prepared for. Not competition, but coexistence. And coexistence with an ex isn't something most marriages are designed to handle without clear boundaries. One evening, about 3 weeks after that initial conversation, she told me she was meeting him for coffee. She said it casually, like informing me she was going to the gym. I asked if I could come, not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. She paused, not long, but long enough. Then she said, I don't think that would be comfortable. Not for me, not for him, for her. That answer clarified everything. This wasn't about maintaining a distant connection. This was about preserving a separate space, a space I wasn't part of. That night, I didn't sleep well, not because I imagined something happening between them, but because I realized something already was happening, not physically, but emotionally. And emotional proximity doesn't need secrecy to exist. It just needs permission. The next morning, I made a decision, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I called a colleague who specialized in family law, not to file anything, just to understand my position, legally, financially, realistically, because whatever this situation was, it wasn't undefined anymore. It was structured, just not in my favor. A few days later, Vivian noticed something had changed in me, not emotionally, but behaviorally. I was calmer, more observant, less reactive. She asked me if everything was okay, and for the first time, I answered without hesitation. I'm adjusting. She nodded, like she understood, but I don't think she understood what I meant, because adjusting doesn't always mean adapting. Sometimes it means preparing. About a month later, we had dinner at a mutual friend's house. Margot Thornton and her husband hosted regularly. It was the kind of gathering where appearances mattered more than conversations. Carter was there. That was the first time I saw him in person. He wasn't what I expected, not threatening, not arrogant, just composed, confident in a quiet way. He greeted me like we had already been introduced somewhere before. That detail stayed with me, because it suggested familiarity I hadn't been part of. Throughout the evening, I observed them, not closely, just enough. Their interactions weren't inappropriate, but they were easy, too easy for two people who were supposed to be in the past. At one point, Vivian laughed at something he said. A real laugh, unfiltered. I hadn't heard that version of her in a while. That's when something settled inside me. Not anger, not jealousy, just clarity. Before we go further, think about this. Would you hold on longer, hoping things shift back, or would you accept what you're seeing and start making decisions based on reality instead of hope? Because hope, in situations like this, can become a delay tactic. That night, when we got home, I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I simply asked one question. Do you see a future where this changes? She didn't answer immediately. Then she said no. That was the most honest moment we had shared in weeks. And it gave me something I hadn't had before. Finality. A few days later, I told her I wanted to separate. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly. She didn't argue. She didn't try to stop me. She just nodded, like she had already considered that possibility. We handled everything the way people in our position usually do. Through lawyers, through structured conversations, through calm decisions that carry permanent consequences. There was no public fallout, no scandal, just two people acknowledging that their definitions of partnership no longer aligned. Months later, I heard they were spending more time together, maybe even considering something more permanent. It didn't shock me. It didn't hurt the way it might have before, because by then, I had already accepted something important. She hadn't betrayed me. She had simply refused to change something that mattered to her, and I had chosen not to live within that structure. That's the part most people misunderstand. Not every ending comes from wrongdoing. Sometimes it comes from incompatibility that reveals itself too late. And sometimes the calmest sentence is the one that ends everything.